Steve Locke is our guest today. He's from the Fletcher School at Tufts. He was trained at Harvard in political economy, where he has his Ph.D. He also has an MPP from the Kennedy School, so he knows what a place like the Humphrey Institute is about. I think it's fair to say, I don't know whether Steve calls himself an Africanist or not, but he is really. I mean, the two subjects that he's talking about today, I think you could say he's a real expert on. Africa and agricultural development. The political part of it, of course, is another dimension, and that's what he's going to be talking about today. He's also done very interesting work with Paul Wahler, having to do with elections and financial conditions and investor behavior in developing countries. He's done a lot of different kinds of work, and a lot of work having to do with development in the third world. The paper that he's presenting today is something he did with those of you who are in political science or close to political science. Robert Bates is somebody who's made a lot of contributions to talking about the political development in Africa. And the two of them got together to produce this. What did you say? It was a World Bank?
Yeah, I'll describe that.
Yeah, okay. And this, the paper that they wrote together, which Steve is presenting the research on today, is called The Political Economy of Agricultural Trade Intervention in Africa. Welcome, Steve Locke.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm from the Midwest, but this is my first time in the Twin Cities or Minnesota. I appreciate you having me here, and I appreciate hearing Paul's decision to wait until April to have me up here. I heard it was a tough go around this last winter. So, as Bob said, the topic is the political economy of agricultural trade interventions in Africa. I'll talk a little bit about the work of my co-author, Robert Bates, when we get to that part. But Bob also mentioned that this is a project that's associated with the World Bank. And so the connection is, and one of the novelties of the paper, is the data set that we have. There has been, for the last few years, a pretty large-scale project funded by the World Bank, led by a trade economist named Kim Anderson from Australia, which has created a new data set of agricultural trade interventions, indicators of agricultural trade interventions by commodity for about 85 countries from 1955 to 2005. So it was an enormous activity. They had individual teams for each of these countries, extremely labor-intensive data collection effort, and they put together this big new data set, which just about 3 or 4 weeks ago has been released publicly, and you can get it from this website. And they commissioned, I think it's going to be 6 books to be done. They gave access to the data set to a selected list of scholars, which in our case was Bob. And Bob asked me to work with him on this paper. Our assignment was for the volume that they're going to produce on the political economy of trade interventions. They've just published, within the last few weeks, 4 volumes of country case studies. There'll be a 5th volume that's going to be on the economic costs of trade protection. That's going to be more of a macroeconomic modeling kind of computable general equilibrium modeling kinds of papers. And then the last volume to be published, which hopefully will be this year, is on the political economy of trade protection. And they asked Bob to write this chapter on Sub-Saharan Africa. Bob asked me to work with him. And so what we've done is we've taken just the African countries out of this data set. I'll show you the list in a moment, but there are 20 countries from Africa that are included in the data set. And they just left it up to us to come up with whatever interpretation we wanted to tell a story about the political economy of the patterns that we found. So from a statistical perspective, what they did was they gave us a dependent variable, and they said, do whatever you want on the right-hand side of your model to explain a story on the political economy of trade distortions in Africa. Countries that we have included here are listed. The abbreviations afterwards refer to the geographic distinctions because there's some recent work to suggest that different geographic zones in Africa almost behave as if they have different kinds of production functions. And so it makes sense to split the country. So we're going to distinguish between resource-rich countries, landlocked countries, and coastal countries, and I've identified them here. If you look closely at this list, you see something that's a little anomalous. For example, Ethiopia, which is both coastal and landlocked, which is a little puzzling until you realize that, well, when Eritrea became independent in, I think it was 94, Ethiopia lost its port, became a landlocked country. So this is the big list. Some of the countries, 3 or 4 of these countries are represented in our study only by cotton. It's commodity-specific data. But for most of the other countries, we have a range of commodities that we look at. And the data set itself is built around, this is sort of the key building block of the different indicators that the data set is constructed to produce. So it's this nominal rate of assistance by commodity, so for a particular commodity. And what this boils down to, in essence, is the tariff, if we're talking about an importable, if it's an exportable, an export tax. But so we can think of this as basically boiling down to the percentage difference in the domestic price of a commodity relative to the relevant border price or international price for that commodity. And that price wedge would be an indicator of the degree of distortion that the policy has imposed within that country on that commodity. The way this is constructed, we're kind of subtracting 1 from this ratio. And so when we look at these numbers, if they're positive NRA indicates that the domestic price is above the international price, so it would be protecting domestic producers of that commodity. And that would reflect a real transfer of welfare and resources from consumers to producers, which when we start to think about the political economy side of it, that's the key kind of question you want to look at. If it's below 0, then the government policy is favoring consumers of that commodity at the expense of producers. And what they do is take this building block, and we can look at this for a specific commodity, or we can aggregate it across different categories of commodities and look at it from different perspectives. So one of the key relationships that we're going to look at, again, as something to be explained, is what the project that created the data set refers to as the relative rate of assistance. And what this is comprised of is we take that nominal rate of assistance for all the tradable agricultural commodities. And then we have nominal rates of assistance for non-agricultural tradable commodities. When we look at this ratio, subtract 1, then we have an indicator that tells us whether government trade policy is discriminating against agriculture relative to the non-agricultural sector or vice versa. So if this ratio is greater than 1, it's going to reflect a government policy that's relatively supportive of agriculture as compared with non-agriculture. If it's greater than 0. And if it's negative, it's less than 0, that's going to reflect relative discrimination against the agricultural sector, which, as we'll see, is very characteristic of African trade agricultural policy.
Excuse me, can I ask you?
Please.
You made a distinction between tradable and non-tradable?
In this case, everything's tradable. So the distinction, is between agriculture and non-agriculture. There's some non-tradables in the data set as well. So this is agriculture, the cross sectors, and then within the agricultural sector, but still within the tradable category of agriculture, we can distinguish between exportable commodities and importable commodities. And so they have created this trade bias indicator, so-called, with exportables in the numerator. So when we subtract 1, we get an indicator which, if positive, would reflect what they think of as a pro-trade, pro-export orientation for the agricultural trade regime. If this indicator is negative, that means there's greater support relatively for importable commodities. That is something like we would call, hi Brian, import substitution strategy. Right? So that would be reflected, we would interpret that as an anti-trade orientation. Let me get my chair out of the way for you.
Sorry, Steve.
No problem. Glad you could make it. So So I just described the broad indicators that of different types of trade interventions and distortions that we're tracking in the data set, and our task is to explain the political economy motivation for the patterns that we see. And so let me show you some of these patterns. Yes, please.
What did you do with exchange rates?
So I didn't do anything, but the people who created the data set, I'll tell you what, I'll go back to this. So this is the exchange rate, this is the CIF price for a tradable commodity, so the landed price. The wedge, the distortionary wedge is calculated by comparing that CIF, no problem, that CIF price for an import or the FOB price for an exportable commodity with the farm gate price adjusted for trade costs, transportation, et cetera, within the country. So this is supposed to be an equilibrium exchange rate. For countries with floating currencies, they just use the official exchange rate, and they had some algorithm that they tried to make some effort to estimate equilibrium exchange rates in other cases. They tried to, but by necessity, they had to be as simple as possible because they had so many countries, and you don't have the data in every country to do a really sophisticated estimation of an equilibrium exchange rate. But they're cognizant of that issue. Okay, so just to begin with, I want to put Africa in its broader context by comparing its relative rate of assistance, this is the relative support for agriculture, with other regions of the world. So you look at Western Europe, North America, very large positive, right? So this is suggesting that rich countries tend to support agriculture highly relative to non-agriculture, very pro-agricultural stance. The pattern for this over time, the Asian pattern is sort of a classical story. As countries get richer, we start by discriminating against agriculture, and then they get richer, and then they're supporting agriculture. So it's a really smooth transition. But Africa, the orange line, stands out clearly here for both the severity and the persistence of its discrimination against agriculture relative to non-agriculture. And you can see even after a period in which Latin America moved towards a neutral stance, moved towards neutrality in the richer countries, Sub-Saharan Africa still stands out, even in 2004-05 when the data ends, still stands out for its relative discrimination against the agricultural sector. And then looking just within Africa now, I want to make this geographic distinction between the resource-rich coastal and landlocked countries. So looking at variation over space and over time in the trade bias indicator, and again, by and large, we see an anti-trade regime, a kind of an import substitution, trade orientation, where exportables are just disfavored relative to importable commodities. Not much variation across regions, except that to say that when we look at the temporal variation and we see some move, again, back towards a more neutral trade regime, particularly in the landlocked countries and in the resource-rich countries, the coastal countries are still maintaining a fairly anti-trade orientation within the agricultural sector. Some intuition, I think, is that the coastal countries are more exposed to trade. Right? So it makes some sense that if that was the way you were thinking, that's how you would wind up.
All of the resource-rich countries show up in two curves, and they also show up as either landlocked or...
A couple of them are in two categories, but it's small enough overlap so that we can reasonably cleanly distinguish between them. But that's a good point. It's not a perfectly exclusive category. For purposes of our study, we also created an aggregation that's a little more in line with the way people who work on African agriculture often think about commodities, which is to distinguish between food crops and cash crops. And so looking at the nominal rate of assistance for food crops, you can see that by and large African governments have tended to protect domestic producers of food crops and to tax domestic producers of export commodities quite severely, as you can see. Now, the landlocked countries are a little different. They're the only category of countries that actually taxes domestic producers of food crops and tax producers of export commodities. The degree of distortion here is relatively small compared with what we saw on the exportable side, on the food crop, cash crop side, at its worst. And you can see that this rate of taxation peaks around 1980. So that was kind of when, from a policy perspective, from agricultural policy, Africa kind of bottoms out. We do see this period of reform, although we do start to see some, again, variation across these zones of Sub-Saharan Africa. The resource-rich countries are still lagging a little bit in terms of reform in the cash crop area. But one of the points that we're going to make when we get to the political dynamics behind these policies is that we think there's some difference in the political forces that shape government's orientation towards cash crops as distinct from food crops. And that will come out, I think, when we get to some of the analysis. By the way, feel free to stop me. I mean, you've already had a few questions, but don't feel you need to sit and wait. It's just anytime you want me to explain something, just stop. So again, this is a relative rate of assistance over time, distinguishing between these three zones of countries. And there's quite a bit of variation here geographically. They're all biased against agriculture, less so, clearly less so in the resource-rich countries, and quite severely so in the landlocked countries. And you can see the pattern over time. Some move towards reform here, particularly visible in the coastal countries. It was never that bad in the resource-rich, and things are still pretty severely biased against agriculture in the landlocked countries.
So do you have any sense of if they're biased against agriculture, what are they supporting? Because they have to be supporting something in this.
Well, in a literal sense, remember this ratio is the support for agriculture divided by the support for non-agriculture. So they're favoring industry, right? So one of the, I mean, it's actually worth talking about the intuition and why that's a problem for agriculture, because if you have relative support that favors industry, which is what's reflected here, okay? So think about what that implies for migration of resources across sectors. Think about what that might imply for investment. Why would you invest in agriculture when the manufacturing is getting all this protection? So it can really have severe dynamic, negative effects on agricultural development. And that's, I think, what we've seen in a lot of African countries.
Why do you assume it's industry rather than mining or forestry?
It could.
Expected?
Well, any tradable non-agricultural sector would be included in that. I used it just as an example, industry. Could be textiles production or something. You're right, for the countries that are the resource-rich countries, okay, for these ones, then we're talking about minerals, although they're the least discriminatory in that particular instance. But you're right, it could be any non-agricultural tradable sector. Okay, so one of the simplifications they had to make in constructing the data set was just to assume that all services were non-tradable and undistorted, which is a very strong assumption, but it's hard to get data on service sector interventions.
Steve, you may be getting to this, but to what extent do these countries that don't support the agriculture sector import and then market subsidized food from the West?
I think that would best be answered here. So what's happening is by and large, they're imposing import tariffs on food commodities. So they're protecting domestic producers of food. So if they're able to get subsidized food, I'm not talking about food aid now, but from a trade policy perspective, we could make an argument that exports from the trade policies of Europe and North America are depressing, commodity prices because of the domestic subsidies. That could be used as a rationale, perhaps, for import tariffs in these countries, but I think this is measured relative to an international price, so the subsidized price would be below that. So they're doing that, a fair amount of that, but they are still taxing in response to that. So this figure is intended to summarize these stylized facts, and it brings us to a slightly higher level of disaggregation. I've got now country observations averaged by decade, and what I've done in constructing these figures is to put together this trade bias indicator on the horizontal axis with the relative rate of assistance on the vertical axis. So if you're to the left of the vertical zero, that's an anti-trade orientation. If you're below the horizontal zero, that would be the anti-agriculture orientation. So if you're in the top right quadrant of this matrix, that means you're pro-trade, pro-agricultural trade and pro-agriculture, and you can see how many African countries wind up in the top right quadrant of these boxes. Just about none. They're concentrated, obviously, in the bottom left quadrant, anti-agriculture, anti-agricultural trade. One of the things I think is kind of interesting when you step back and you look, kind of zoom your eyes across the decades here, is this convergence. You start out, particularly on the horizontal, on the trade bias indicator, you start out, it's a really high degree of dispersion, somewhat more concentrated in terms of the anti-agricultural bias. And over time, these countries kind of converge. They don't converge quite where you want them to converge, but I think it's a kind of an interesting observation when you step back. And what I see here is a kind of incomplete process of policy reform. There's been some improvement. On average, things are better, but there's still some variation, and still most of the countries are concentrated. I don't want to, I gave this talk, I said, they're in the bad box. And so it's bad? Well, I mean, people who work on agriculture like to not see bias against agriculture. You'd like to see them right here instead of down here. So a few countries are neutral in both cases, but by and large, even by the last, first five years of this decade, African countries are still concentrated in the anti-trade, anti-agriculture box.
Is that Zambia up there? Is that Zambia?
No,
Which
South
decade?
Africa.
South Africa.
1980s.
ZAF would be South Africa.
I wonder, in the political economy, how much of the African countries who are favoring industry are following the old model, which has been true in Latin America and other places, where the industry was associated with economic development, with progress in that case. So one need to look a little bit hard numbers of that to see whether this is simply a carryover or is it really some benefits are coming from it.
That's, I think, a really interesting point. The kind of orientation you're talking about, it really is a kind of a post-war development model, formalized in the early 1950s by W. Arthur Lewis. And Lewis, it was a very direct transmission of these ideas. W. Arthur Lewis was a personal economic advisor to Kwame Nkrumah, first president of independent Ghana. As it turns out, Ghana is not doing too badly here. But more broadly, that's an interesting problem because you sort of have an economic paradigm that says, we'll do this. One of the things that I find very interesting about the political economy analyses is that they can look at the same phenomenon, and instead of saying, well, this was the economic paradigm, there's a completely different kind of lens and a completely different kind of explanation, which is kind of where we're headed here. But by and large, I think that there's been so much discussion of the role of agriculture, and it's been 50 years since the Lewis model was published. I hesitate to say that, particularly for the later periods, that could have carried over into the 1970s, but by this period, I think those models were not guiding government policy. I think that the political economy explanations are more direct. So let me talk a little bit about the theoretical, sort of conceptual foundation for the political economy lens that I want to bring here and set out some hypotheses that we'll test. Now, I want to talk a little bit about work by my co-author, Bob Bates. I'm describing this as Batesian political economy. Now, Bob doesn't use that phrase himself, but when he's not around, I use it because, if anybody has read, if you've read anything about the political economy of African development, particularly African agriculture, this is the book that you read, Markets and States in Tropical Africa, seminal work by Bob in 1981. Really was the first one to bring a kind of rational choice political economy analysis to Sub-Saharan Africa. And he asked this very famous question: why do rational policymakers so often adopt policies that harm the majority of people in their country? How could that be rational? Most of these guys are farmers. So the kind of foundation for the answer to that question draws on earlier classic work by Mansur Olson. You may be familiar with the logic of collective action. This sort of argument that in a lobbying context, small is powerful. Why? Because because when you have a large group, first of all, there's a tendency for free riding. It's costly to lobby for your interests. I'll just let you guys handle it. I'll enjoy the policy reforms. You guys incur the cost of lobbying for that policy. No individual in the large group has enough influence to change policy on their own, and so you get this dispersed effect, and a large group becomes a weak lobby. The small group, where you can monitor the free riding, where the cost of organization is lower, that in this perspective would be a stronger lobby. That's on one side of it. Then in the case of food, we can also think about things like Engel's law, which, if you remember from consumer theory and microeconomics, is the idea that households, or countries even, expenditure on necessities, the budget share on necessities, goes down as your income goes up. Okay, so think about poor consumers. These are the people who are concentrated in the cities where the government has its base. And poor consumers in developing countries often spend 50–60% of their household budget on food. It matters to them what the price of food is, and they create a political force calling for cheap food. Industrialists would share that interest because they're employing an urban labor force, and their cost of hiring that labor is lower when food is cheap. The government would join that coalition too, because the government employs a lot of people in a lot of these countries. So in poor countries, the concentrated interests favor cheap food. That changes when the budget share to food goes down when you get richer. So in the United States, we spend maybe 10% of our budget on food. We don't care that much about the price of food relative to the farm lobby, which is quite powerful. I think in Minnesota, I don't have to tell you that. So in an African setting, when agriculture is the largest sector of the economy, farmers are the largest group, governments tend to manipulate policies contrary to the interests of farmers. And then we see the opposite being true in, say, richer countries, where farmers tend to be a small percentage of the population. And in fact, that makes it politically rational to discriminate against that majority. And in fact, this observation that poor countries tend to tax agriculture while rich countries tend to subsidize it is such a pervasive and robust observation that it's kind of been called the development paradox. Now that's driven by levels of income. Okay, as your country gets richer, you see this transition. We're just looking at Africa though. All the countries we're looking at are relatively poor. They have similar levels of income, so we've got to look somewhere else for an explanation for these patterns that we see. And so we're going to consider the things that follow from variation that we do observe across African countries. One is variation in institutions, and I'll have a specific institution in mind that I'll talk about. And also resource endowments. Differences in resource endowments might influence the incentives to engage in redistributive politics, or just to capture revenue by, say, taxing exports. So we're going to consider these three channels: political institutions, and in particular, the effect of electoral party competition. We're going to look at redistributive politics, revenue imperative. I'll talk about each one briefly. So with regard to political institutions, please.
The demographics through that period from 1980 to 2000, there must be a greater concentration in the urban communities.
You mean increasing over time?
Yes.
Somewhat so, yes. It's a panel data set, so we've got observations on 20 countries over about a 35-year period of time, and yes, there is some movement towards urbanization in those countries. It turns out to be relatively slow. It turns out to be a relatively small movement in Africa because it's still quite poor, as opposed to, say, Asia, where you see a much more rapid kind of population shift towards the urban sector. In terms of the statistical analysis, it winds up that most of that variation in the rural population share is in the cross-section. It's across countries. It's not within countries over time. There is some, you're right, but it's not the dominant dimension of the data. I'll come back to that rural population share because it's exactly the right question. It's critical to what we're going to do. So with regard to political institutions, the sort of baseline, sort of idea that we have is that as lobbyists, African farmers will be disadvantaged for the reasons I was describing. But how does that change if we have electoral party competition? How does that change the incentives facing policymakers in addressing the agricultural sector. And in terms of this electoral party competition, we see a really dramatic transition in Sub-Saharan Africa over this period of time. So this index of electoral party competition, I'll show you the details on the next slide, but just to give you the big picture, by decade, it's a 7-point scale, increasing in terms of electoral party competition, in terms of the degree of competition that policymakers engage in. So 6 and 7 are going to be the categories that we consider to be competitive political systems. And you can see when you look at the 1970s, almost all of the observations that we have are down in the 2-3 range. Hardly any competition going on politically in Africa in the 1970s. And there's a really strong dynamic here, so that by the time you get to the 2000-2005 period, 85-90% of the observations are in fact politically competitive systems by the definition that I'll show you. Right, so in the 1990s in particular were a big watershed in terms of the sort of democratization of Africa in terms of the number of elections and the competitiveness of those elections. So how does that change this underlying political dynamic? It gives us the hypothesis, the first of our 3 hypotheses, which is that we expect, and this goes back to the demographic point directly, that agricultural taxation would increase with the rural population share. When you have a lot of farmers relative to non-farmers, there's going to be a high degree of taxation, but perhaps not if there's electoral party competition. And that's hypothesis. Here's the way we're measuring that competition. I'll give you a second to glance over this, but it's a 7-point scale. There, it's a kind of a hierarchical scale. The categories are mutually exclusive. This was a rating system that was developed originally by 2 graduate students at Bob Bates's, Smita Singh and Karen Faree, and has since been incorporated into, they did it for Africa originally. It's been incorporated now in a global sample in a data set that might be of use to you called the Database of Political Institutions, very large database collected by the research division of the World Bank, also available online. So that includes this index of electoral competition. I don't know if anybody wants to stop here and ask questions, but basically in 6s and 7s we have multi-party competition with multiple candidates, and the distinction here is, well, if in the 6th category, if the incumbent, or the president rather, won more than 75% of the vote, we might think it's not perfectly competitive, but at least there were multiple candidates from multiple parties. There are other indicators out there. You might have seen things from Freedom House. There's the Polity 4 data set. Our argument is that this is a better indicator because it's more specific, it's more objective. So in the Freedom House indicator, for example, it's based on surveys that require the respondents to make subjective judgments about the degree of political freedom. This is something that's, pretty transparent. And
Look like you're trying to prove the Amartya Sen's theory as well about famines and democracy.
yeah, people have been talking about that. I think there's been some contrary evidence there, but I haven't, that's a very powerful idea though. With regard to redistributive politics, that second channel that we want to consider, this follows to some extent from the differences in natural resource endowments in countries. And in particular, what we see is that a lot of conflict in Africa is not class conflict, it's regional conflict. And it's regional conflict based on the distribution of natural resources. And so, in fact, some large proportion of countries have a specific region that's regarded as a privileged region. Most of those regions are privileged because of the concentration of the production of cash crops in that region. All right, and so the idea is, well, here's some examples. Okay, so we could think about coffee in Kenya, in the central province. We could think about the Kilimanjaro region of Tanzania, and we see real differences in the policy orientation of, say, Jomo Kenyatta and Julius Nyerere with regard to those resources. And, at least for illustrative purposes, I want to say it's because that Kenyatta came from the coffee region. Nyerere's support was urban and from the semi-arid zones. So he really taxed those cash crop regions. Kenyatta protected those cash crop regions. And it leads to this hypothesis that we have that privileged regions, privileged cash crop regions, will be targets for redistributive taxation. they're like a sitting duck, sitting out there for disadvantaged groups that would have the authority through government to tax them, but maybe not if the president comes from that privileged region. So that's hypothesis 2. And finally, revenue imperative. A lot of African governments, we saw these high rates of taxation of agricultural exports. Well, a lot of African governments get 20, 25, at least used to get 20, 25% of their revenue by taxing agricultural exports. Important source of revenue for poor, underfunded governments. And so that might be a reason as well to tax agricultural exports. But we want to think about the effect of resource endowments in this way. If resource-rich governments have other sources of funding, then we hypothesize that they could fund transfers in other ways than by taxing food and producers and consumers. And so they would forego some of the taxation of food consumers that we saw in the stylized facts, and also perhaps forego some of the taxation of export producers. So that would be something that might distinguish the resource-rich countries. Did I see a hand? I thought I saw somebody wanted to. Okay. So those are our hypotheses, which I'll just summarize here. So the first one, and really I would say our central hypothesis, is this one about agricultural taxation increasing with the rural population share, but not in competitive situations. That if there's a cash crop region, a privileged cash crop region, that will be taxed unless the president comes from there. And finally, that the resource-rich countries will shift their relative support for cash and food crops in the way described here by foregoing taxation of food consumers and export cash crop producers.
The agriculture taxation may not be per se bad. It
Pardon?
depends. Agriculture taxation may not be per se bad policy, but it is, what is it used for? If it is used to subsidize the food, that's quite a different matter.
Well,
you see, because many countries have used the revenues from the agriculture sector to promote the modern sector.
right, but in doing so, they would be taxing the poor to subsidize the rich.
Well, you need capital formation if you didn't have it, so you, but if you use that to subsidize the food to keep the electorate happy in the urban area, that's quite a different matter. You see, which is, but you need to show growth and development taking place, and for that you need some capital formation.
That's fair enough. But I would counter that in a country where agriculture is the largest share of GDP and the rural sector is 60-70% of the labor force, that you're not going to see growth in the macroeconomy if you, over a long period of time, pull the rug out from underneath the agricultural sector. Not that it's a different discussion, not that agriculture is going to lead the growth process, but I think you undermine the growth process by sort of kicking the stool out from underneath the agricultural sector. And in fact, what we saw was that they were taxing food imports in a number of cases, not subsidizing those food imports.
What about land ownership traditions in some of these countries? The collective, I mean, is policy can't override that, but it's very difficult and politically almost impossible.
So the argument, but what about land?
Well, I'm looking at it from the point of view individual incentive, to participate in the agricultural economy.
And
It's a big issue, at least in many countries where individuals don't own the land. It's the tribe, it's the ethnic group.
I think that's a good point. It's not something that we have data on, so I can't really, bring it into the analysis. But I think that's a very valid point. By and large, Africa is not a land scarce place. It's not like you think of Asia or South Asia where the plots are quite small and there's a lot of landless labor. You don't see the same shares of rural landless labor in Africa that you see in South Asia, for example. But clearly land ownership would be an important factor here. Now, I don't want to belabor the statistical background here, but just so if you're interested in this, the way I'm approaching this, well, there's two ways that we're approaching this. One is what I'll refer to as a linear parametric regression. So I'm going to take my nominal rate of assistance or my relative rate of assistance or whatever, that's going to be over here. That's what I want to explain. We've got a dummy variable for electoral competition, The key here is going to be the rural population share and the interaction between the two, and a bunch of other control variables that are listed here. Going to apply a variety of econometric techniques to estimating this relationship, the idea of which is that this is a specification that allows me to ask, well, we're concerned about what happens to the rate of taxation as the rural population share increases. So I'm concerned about this slope, and I can ask whether that slope changes when we have electoral competition. Or I can ask, what's the effect of electoral competition? Does it raise or lower taxation? And what effect does it have in shifting that relationship? Now, there's another approach that we take that's much more intuitive, and that's the one I want to stress, which is a second econometric story. It's called semi-parametric or partially linear regression. And it gives us some pictures rather than tables of numbers, so it's something that's a lot easier to talk about. And what I'm doing here is simply controlling as in a linear regression for all of these x variables and leaving undefined the shape of the relationship between the rural population share and my indicator of taxation. All right, so it can take whatever shape is there in the data. It's called a non-parametric relationship. And in order to get the story that would come out of this interaction term, I simply do this twice. I do it once for those countries that don't have political competition, and once for those countries that do have political competition. And it leads to a set of results like this. So the picture here, we're looking at the relative rate of assistance here. Remember, positive numbers show support for agriculture relative to non-agriculture. Negative, discrimination against agriculture. The more negative, the more relative discrimination against agriculture. The horizontal axis is the rural population share. So here's the demographics, right? And what we're seeing is a negative relationship, particularly at the high end, although we have fewer observations out here. The sample average is at about 75% rural population share. But this is kind of what we expect to see in those settings that lack electoral competition. As the rural population share becomes very large, the rate of taxation increases. When we re-estimate this relationship for those countries with electoral party competition, this is the relationship between population share and discrimination against agriculture. So what we're seeing is that political competition turns this lobbying disadvantage of large numbers into an electoral advantage. It changes the incentives that policymakers face, and by and large protects the rural population from what had otherwise been a pretty predatory approach by the government. So this is the relative rate of assistance. The next, in the background, there's other variables that are controlled for linearly, and I just want to note that per capita income is not a significant explanation here.
Stephen, are these within country effects in the non-parametric? So do we?
They're cross-sectional.
So-
Well, it's a panel. It's a pooled cross-section time series.
Right, so I'm wondering, yeah, is it the shift in rural population within countries that we're picking up here, is all the activity in the cross-section?
More of the activities in the cross-section than the within-country variation. There is some within-country variation. This is just pooled across both of them. The background control vector includes year dummies, right? So at least I'm taking that out of the picture as well. Okay? But it's a pooled relationship. I have, by the way, I do have the regression output. If anybody wants to see it, I'm happy to talk about the regression tables. But unless you all get coffee first, it could be a tough road to hoe. So agricultural importables. So here's our nominal rate of assistance for importables. The relationship very significantly negative as the rural population share increases, as we would expect in the non-competitive systems. So what happens to this relationship in the competitive systems? Again, it's essentially a neutral taxation, zero taxation of importable commodities when we have this political competition going on. And so the statistics of it are that it changes both the slope and there's a shift effect at certain points. There's a big significant shift effect here when we have a large rural population share. And again, if we were looking at the regression table, I can show you how that kind of follows from the partial derivatives of the regression equation, but I think the pictures tell the story better. And again, GDP is insignificant. I want to note that as well. Okay, because the contrast is going to be between these importable commodities and what I'm going to show you next, which are the exportable commodities. And so here again, we're sustaining the story.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's at 85% in the other one too, that we had the big change in the slope of the graph, right?
Mhm.
So there, is this now that we have one country out at 90% or something that's driving everything?
Well, there's
Or
relatively
is there
few,
something
I mean, there's
else?
relatively few observations out here. I don't think they're all just from one country. But the shift effect is significant here throughout, right? So there's this question of the slope. In fact, this relationship in the linear regression, it's got a negative point estimate, but it's not statistically different from 0. But the shift effects are statistically different from 0.
No, I was just looking at the, in the semi-parametric
Yeah.
regression, we can see that the slope changes significantly at 85 in both of those, and I'm just sort of wondering what's happening at that point.
Right. There are fewer observations out here.
What's the relationship between essentially a 2-point scale electoral competition, electoral competition or no electoral competition, the original 7-point scale usually?
So what I've done is, because I needed to split the sample, so we drew a line in between 5 and 6. Okay, if you're a 6 or a 7, then you're here. 1 through 5, you're here.
And do you have electoral competition against rural population share over time?
Just as a direct relationship? No.
I'm just grasping that you might have greater electoral competition with a declining rural population share.
That's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. I haven't looked at that relationship. But I think what we see, the question is there a causal relationship there, right? Because over time, the rural population shares are going down, if slowly. And over time, the incidence of competitive elections is going up rapidly. I would hesitate to assume that there's a causal relationship there.
Well, I'm just thinking that would reinforce Engel's law, the notion that the greater urbanization will, and the desire to drive down the food costs would reduce the subsidy for, or increase the discrimination against domestic agriculture.
I think that's worth looking into. I think it could be in the background there. All right, so we had the importables, exportables. Now this one is explicitly 0 because Miles is right. Now the downturn isn't really out until the 90s, right? So this is not. So when we just look at this linearly, this is 0. Okay, and that's one of the key distinctions that between exportables and importables, right? Because we did see a pretty significant negative relationship on the importable commodities. Everybody grows food. Cash crops might be concentrated in certain places. Okay, and that's why I think the intuition for why the importable commodities are going to show that negative association with the rural population share. Okay, so but we have at least it's level, but it's a high degree of taxation of these agricultural export crops in the non-competitive systems. And in the competitive systems, a significant positive shift effect. It's not a function of the rural population share, but in competitive systems, the average rate of taxation is substantially lower. So we get this significant shift, it's significant all the way through, I think. But it does raise this question, what's different? What is it that is different about importables and exportables such that the political dynamic to push them in different directions? And note that now per capita income is significant, another indication that something is different between the politics of cash crops, the politics, politics of exportables, the politics of importables, which leads us to the final two questions. I don't have the semi-parametric, so let me just summarize the regression results here. With regard to this question of whether, when we see a privileged cash crop region, does it get taxed? The answer is yes. At least weekly statistically we have evidence that if there's a privileged region, the relative support for cash crops does go down. So they are sitting ducks for redistributive taxation. The coffee sector of Tanzania, for example. There are other examples as well we could talk about. Like Kenyatta. In Kenya, we saw With regard to coffee, we've got Houphouët-Boigny in the Ivory Coast, which he came from the cocoa producing zone. He was very favorable towards cocoa producers. And right next door in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, like Nyere, came from a semi-arid zone, he had urban support, taxed very heavily the producers of cocoa in Ghana. Okay, but when, in those other cases, well, in those cases I just mentioned, when the president comes from that region, we don't see this effect anymore. In fact, it turns into positive support when it's a particular cash crop that comes from a particular place and the president's from there. Not surprising, but it's kind of nice to have data on it. I mean, it's actually a not common kind of data. One of the other things that we see is that in considering the ratio of the support to cash crops relative to food crops, it turns out that it changes, but it changes not because of what's going on with food crops, but because of what's going on with cash crops. That it really is focusing in that taxation on the cash crops. If we look at the regression table, you'd see significant changes in cash crops, significant changes in the relationship between cash crops and food crops, but nothing's going on with the food crops. In fact, the significant variables in the food crop regression are the variables that we had before, the rural population share, the competitive elections. But there's a kind of an observational equivalence here. If we see a cash crop region and we see it getting taxed, at least when the president's not from there, that could be motivated by a desire for redistributive taxation, but it could also just be the revenue imperative. It's a source of revenue, let's tax it. So we have to look at the dummy variable for resource-rich countries in that case. And here we find sort of half support for our hypothesis, our third hypothesis. All right, what we see is that, in fact, that relationship between cash and food crop support, that the ratio of those two does in fact go up in the resource-rich countries as we hypothesize, but only for half the reason that we hypothesize. It turns out, as it says here, that they still tax their cash crop producers, but they stop taxing their food consumers so much when they're resource-rich countries, potentially because of this alternative source of revenue. So the farmers are still getting hit by the government, and the benefits of this resource abundance are transferred to the consumers of food. So the ratio changes, but only for half the reason that we expected. So that is what we have in the paper, and I guess we have plenty of time for, what do we have? It's over at 2?
Yeah.
So we have 15, 20 minutes, or whatever.
Thank you. Very
Yes, you in the
concise,
back.
very
Yeah,
good.
that's right.
In the brown sweater.
That's right. So Steve, talk about some of the reasonable alternative explanations for the results you have that you don't either explicitly control for that are lurking. And I'll throw out a few that are issues related not so much to electoral competition, but to other more deep-rooted institutional differences that may be lurking into institutional difference biases in the country. So for instance, in the traditions of research on political economy in Africa, they often make a distinction between the countries based on their colonial heritage. So French versus British, for instance, and that we know that it also has trappings post-colonial based on all sorts of other political economy issues. So the old CFA region means that monetary policy is not independent in the former French colonies. So there are fewer kind of policy levers available, say, to executives in the French area to exploit against rural populations. How might those issues apply, if at all, generally, even if in your data set, I don't know, I can't remember what it is, you got 20 countries, maybe there are only 3 French ones in there. How might some of those other institutional issues apply, if at all?
So, Paul, what you're asking is, what do you think is true, even though it doesn't come out of this, directly out of this research?
Yeah, it might not. I'm just going to think, what are the other plausible alternatives that therefore you got to look into?
Another way of rephrasing that would be say, what
I
do you
don't
think's
believe
really
it.
happening? Yeah. What do you think's really happening here?
I
Besides what
should
you
say
told me?
again, for those of you who came in late, these guys are friends.
Folks,
They
my
work-
friend
they,
Paul.
They work, they
Yeah.
do research together, and Paul's responsible for Steve being here today, so we're very grateful.
So, good question. I have a few responses there. First, on the colonial one, you're right in the CFA zone, so most of the former French colonies are members of a currency union in West Africa. They don't control their monetary policy, and they don't control their exchange rate. So what we're not seeing monetary effects here anyway. I mean, they do control their trade regimes. But you raise an interesting point. I mean, this whole project is a successor to an important set of studies done through World Bank support about 20 years ago by Kruger, Schiff, and Valdez. And what they found in looking at taxation of agriculture in Africa was that there were direct interventions of the kind I'm measuring here, and they were taxing agriculture, but there were indirect forms of taxation of agriculture in Africa, coming in particular from the overvaluation of exchange rates, right, that were actually of greater magnitude than the direct taxation of agriculture. Now, the CFA countries don't control their exchange rates, but in fact the CFA was overvalued up through the early 1990s, and that's why they had 100% devaluation of the CFA in 1994. I don't know of any other dimensions of the colonial heritage that would explain this. I mean, we have marketing boards that are a vestige of colonialism. I know more about the marketing boards in some of the former British colonies like Kenya and Ghana than I do, but there are marketing boards for cotton in the French West African countries as well. So it's hard for me to really agree that colonial heritage is explaining what's going on here, except
Do the marketing boards increase the efficiency and ease of greater taxation?
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They were used
And so that's, but you're saying that the variation would,
not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, it's funny, I was talking earlier in response to the question about development paradigms, about different lenses of analysis here. And, you know, when I first encountered this work by Bates, I was reading it as an economist, and, you know, economists think about markets, and we think about price formation, and we think about, you know, policy interventions, but we think about exchange of ownership and price formation and all this kind of stuff. And you read Markets and States in Tropical Africa, he describes markets as an arena for conflict between the state and the peasant. And the marketing boards were the army in a sense, right? They would go out and extract resources from the countryside for the benefit of industrialists, for the benefit of the government, for the benefit of urban consumers. And it's just a whole different perspective that I think they're really fascinating to consider how you can explain the same phenomenon from different angles.
just to follow up on this, Steve, that's certainly true that marketing boards do that. My question was that, do they do it uniquely? I mean, in other words, is that, I mean, are other mechanisms just as effective?
The nice thing about a marketing board, from I say nice in quotation marks, is that the revenue transfer to the government is direct. The other ones are more indirect. You think about border, you know, taxation. There's a lot of other actors involved. So these marketing boards, I think have uniformly been vehicles for resource extraction from the countryside. Paul, was there anything else that okay. Right.
So another variable, I mean, obviously democratic leaders, we like to think they're more enlightened than dictators, not necessarily always true when it comes to these issues, but overly dependence on revenues from cash crops makes you highly susceptible to the global variances in price.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that some of these governments take that into consideration, but external actors do, like the World Bank and other donors who are advising these governments on, you know, what to do in terms of competing within the global economy and what to depend on and not depend on and the like. And that's one issue. The other issue is the extent to which these governments still try to control the inputs to agriculture, you know, fertilizer, seed, all of those things, whether those are parastatals or whether they're market-oriented. I mean, these are sort of variables that might have an impact on your thesis.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me comment on both. The first, with regard to inputs, to the extent that the teams for each country in creating these indicators were able to get data on input distortions, input price distortions, they factor those in calculating the sort of domestic export parity price for the commodity. Right? So in principle, that's part of the data set. In practice, it's hard to get those data. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. It's an important point. My sense is that there's been reform in the marketing of inputs. By and large, you know, it used to all be state monopolies. It's not anymore. Now, of course, there's famous cases in Africa of subsidizing fertilizer that I think the results of which are yet to be determined. And in terms of these international price effects for the tradable commodities, I think that's a really interesting question. And what the extension of that question then is, well, how do governments use these policies in response to those fluctuations in the international prices for those commodities? So we're thinking about export commodities in particular, like cocoa, and how does the government kind of reply to that? And for a different project that I'm doing having to do with rice in West Africa, I took a look for a couple countries at the nominal rate of assistance for rice, so this is the border tariff on rice. And I looked at it over a period of several decades for Ghana and for Senegal, and looked at it in relationship to the international price of rice. And it was really striking, because what happens is when the price of rice goes up, the taxation goes down, and vice versa, and these things move just opposite to each other. So they're
quickly enough.
Yeah, and they're using these nominal rates of assistance, using that trade policy to stabilize, to buffer the impact. This is a food import in this particular case, to stabilize domestic prices in the face of those international price fluctuations. But, and this goes back to the marketing board question. So Ghana had, I forget what it's called, a national food procurement agency or something that had a monopoly on food trade up until 1984. So this relationship, this strongly inverse relationship, stops in 1984 when they came up their monopoly, the state monopoly on trade, and all of a sudden some more of that international volatility gets transmitted into domestic markets. And, yeah, go ahead.
If I could just go back in my mind to that series of scatter diagrams you had, where in the last one they were...
You don't have to go in your mind, I'll take you. We can all go there with you. That was, I'm getting there. That one?
Yeah, and you commented on how much they converge toward the end.
Yeah.
And are also moving more toward the center, which I presume would mean less intervention in
Right.
general. If you think about what was happening at the same time, it was the international financial institutions were putting a lot of pressure on countries in that same direction. And
Right.
I'm wondering how many of the things that you're seeing, the whole analysis kind of assumes that countries are making decisions. And in fact, if a lot of those decisions are being imposed through structural adjustment agreements or something instead, maybe you have to go back and look at how the international institutions were viewing differentially different kinds of countries.
I think that's a really important question. It kind of belongs in the category of Paul's questions about what else could it be explaining these results. You missed that one. I think what I would argue, why I would suggest that it's not just a reflection of structural adjustment, is because if that were it, you'd have to argue that all the structural adjustment was happening in the democratic countries, right? Because otherwise they're still in trouble. It would have to be all happening up here if it was structural adjustment. And I would argue, by and large, it was these countries that were less likely to be implementing the adjustment programs. Think about a case like Ghana, which was the first and most successful of these reform. I'm sure you're very familiar with this, right? Ghana implemented was sort of poster child of structural adjustment in the 1980s. In Africa, Jerry Rawlings took over his second coup, New Year's Eve 1982. No party politics for 10 years. And at the end of those 10 years, they had an election in 1992. The reform program started to unravel. So I think it's a valid question. I think to attribute these results to adjustment would be contrary to my sense of the political dynamics. I think Tanzania is the same kind of story. Kenya is the same kind of story. It's not the democratic, it was not the most democratic countries that were doing the adjustment.
Just one first short question, and then I want to make a statement and see if you agree or not.
Okay.
The first one is you use the OLS in estimates, is that correct?
It's correct but not complete. Yes, I used OLS. I also estimated random effects models and something called system GMM.
Because when you just listed the weak relationship, the strong relationship, I was just trying to understand that what the variance was explained and what was unexplained variance was in those situations. And from the policy point of view, will it be okay for me to conclude from your study that actually 2 points. One, competition introduced through political institution is not deterrent to development. And secondly, the more important part is that it requires for institutional reform.
Yes, I would agree with both of those statements. I mean, I think when you use the word development, we might have different ideas in our minds of what that means. But if part of it is associated with poverty alleviation, and we look at countries where 70% of the population are farmers and that poverty is concentrated in the rural sector, if what we see is, what I think we see, which is that the incentives change for policymakers when they face political competition in such a way that they don't discriminate against that majority, then yes, I would say that's probably directly quite a good thing for poverty alleviation, which I would argue is a central component of development. I don't know how far you want to get into your first question about the econometrics, but I've got OLS regressions, random effects, system GMM. This is the importable agriculture case. You can see, for instance, that rural population share has got a significant negative coefficient. This one has the interaction term. This one has a lag-dependent variable. Doesn't have to be significant in the random effects, but it's significant in 2 out of the 3 estimators.
Can you explain what 2/5 of the variation they
2/5, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got about 40%. The R-square is about 40%. I mean, the R-square.
Is it adjusted for degrees of freedom?
The R-squared?
Yeah.
It's not an
Well,
adjusted
it's-
R-squared, no, but it wouldn't change that much. I mean, we got about 375 observations here.
Oh, okay.
375 and about, on average.
Because you have been saying few observations. So
Well, no, what I meant by few observations is, that there aren't that many countries with more than 85% rural population.
And that one too.
But in terms of the main relationship that I'm trying to look at, which is this business about electoral competition, which you see as positive and significant there, is that about 38% of the sample averaged over time is in that competitive category. So there's enough there to work with.
From a foreign investor standpoint, one of the most troubling things for Africa has been policy changes.
The instability of policy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there any way in your research that you've seen those policies become more stable as the elections become more competitive or not?
I haven't, let me say this. I'm starting perhaps a new research project, which is to look at these nominal rates of protection as a function, well, to see if they change in election years. Right? That would be, I think, an interesting question. So were you asking about democratization in general or elections in particular? I mean, what I showed you in the stylized facts, those are smooth, right? So those are smooth non-parametric relationships. Doesn't show the little volatility in each year. It shows the broad trends, and the broad trends were towards reform over time. I hesitate to describe results of an analysis that I haven't really done, other than to just poke around very briefly. But I think there will be evidence that in election years these relationships shift. So what it could be is that we see a tendency towards reform, and I'm generalizing here from other work that I've done and work that I've done with Paul on elections and macroeconomic variables, where we see in competitive systems, on average, better macroeconomic policies, but bigger election year fluctuations, right? So it's like 3 steps forward, 1 step back when you have that election year. Awesome.
I know this is a story about Africa because that's where the data are, and those are what your interests are. But is this political economy story also a story, would we find this if we weren't looking in Africa? So if we were looking at the political economy for agriculture within the United States, for instance?
Right, so what I've been working on for the last few months with Bob Bates is exactly that question, not about the United States in particular, but basically taking the rest of the data set. I mean, this was our assignment, was take the Africa data, come up with a story. So now we're taking some of these stories and testing them against data from the rest of the data set. And we are seeing these effects, very dramatically so, more so in fact than what we see in just the Africa data. That when you look at this relative rate of assistance as a function of the rural population share, and you distinguish between the competitive and the non-competitive countries, huge divergence, such that it's way positive in the competitive places and negative in the non-competitive places. Big difference, controlling for years, controlling for a region, controlling for a whole bunch of things. Still working on that.
We have time for one more question. Yeah?
Wouldn't China seem to be an elephant in the room that contradicts that hypothesis?
Well, I'm not, I mean, what's the agricultural taxation regime in China? I'm not aware.
It's
of it.
not simply taxation, but expropriation of land for development.
Sure,
purposes.
sure. I mean that's a kind of a different story. The data that we have would be looking at China. I think it's in the data set, but it's just one observation. Looking at these trade tax indicators. So yeah, the expropriation of land, all that stuff is important. But I think that sort of sustains what I'm saying, right? Because here you have a non-competitive system, and if not in terms of their trade taxes, then in terms of their land policies that Brian asked about earlier, they're still taking it out on farmers, right? And that would be consistent with my hypothesis.
They also have a voracious appetite, which requires a lot more importing than they're doing now.
Yeah, and probably that coastal economy that's growing by leaps and bounds is probably eating a lot of imported food too.
No. Thank you, Steve, very much. Really.
It's a pleasure.
See you all next fall. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for coming. Good to see you.
Meet you out here.
I'd love to come back.
Research.
Yeah.